Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for hanging around. You had me for 2 hours, right? All right, you're stuck with me? Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to talk with you about my passion, which is turfgrass. And I always like to begin these presentations. First of all, I love speaking to the master gardeners because you folks love plants. But then I usually have to ask, how many, we'll ask it this way, how many dislike turf? Ooh, there's a few, okay. There's a few hands, a few more than normal. Uh-oh, this is going to be a tough crowd tonight. But I'm going to ask the same question when we're finished, and hopefully there might not be as many hands raised. So it's nice to be here again, and we're going to kind of try to cover, obviously, a lot of information in a little bit of time, but I'll try to take questions as we go along, so don't hesitate if you don't get something or just want to ask about it, feel free to do so. But we need to move through everything. So hopefully you might have a question, but we'll probably eventually get to it in the presentation. Let's hope. Okay, so I'll back up here. I show this at the end again, and by the way, I'll make this presentation available to you, so you don't have to take copious notes. This is not really following, verbatim the handbook that you have. So it's kind of my own take on turf. And so, but if you're interested in any information any and all information that we produce in our program, it's at turfgrass.ucr.edu. And I'm trying to make it still a work in progress, but I'm trying to make it a kind of a one-stop shopping for information about turf, not just in the 10 years that I've been at UCR, but in the history of our program, which dates back to the 50s, 60s. And then more recently, I've kind of gotten into this century, I guess, and now I have a Twitter handle. Oh. So I'm at UCR Turfgrass, and then my former postdoc, who's now kind of more my colleague, Marco Schiavone, he's at UCR Saving Turf. So we try to tweet things that are kind of like a lot of related to the research we do, and a lot of the research we do, as you're going to see, is related to water use. So anyway, I'll show this again at the end, and again, the presentation will be available to you. So what we're going to do tonight, tell you a little bit about my background, kind of just introduce turf, we'll get some of the lingo, and then one of the major things I wanted to talk with you about tonight is, not all grasses are the same. We lump them into two categories. One of those we should be using, the other one we really shouldn't be using. And unfortunately, we're using the ones we shouldn't be using. So we'll talk about that. Of course, establishment, irrigation, very important, fertility, mowing, cultivation, and pest control. So we'll try to get through, that's a lot of material in 2 hours, but let's dive in here. So who I'm not, I'm Baird. I often am called Beard when I'm introduced, but I'm Jim Baird. As my wife will attest, I love to eat, but can't cook very much, so definitely not the guy on the left. And then, interestingly, there's kind of the man in our discipline, Dr. Jim Beard. He's written all the major textbooks. So you won't believe how many times in my career I've been asked to sign his books. And so you got to be famous for something, right? I'm not, I'm famously mistaken, I guess, for him. So not these guys. Some people spend kind of their entire career in one place. That's not me. As you could see, I was born and raised in Colorado. So, but I started out at Penn State because I grew up playing golf. I started playing golf when I was 13, and then we lived next to a municipal course back in Colorado. I could jump through onto the golf course from my neighbor's yard. And then eventually I just wanted to get a job, and so I got a job on the maintenance crew for the golf course, and the rest is history. That's all I've ever done since then. And so tried to go to the schools that were the top programs for turf. So Penn State is where I started. It was a little costly out-of-state tuition, so I ended up coming back after 2 years, finished at Colorado State, has a very good turf program as well. And then I got some really good advice from my advisor at Colorado State, and because I was thinking about going to graduate school, and he said, you need to go down south and learn about warm season grasses, what we just mentioned a few minutes ago. Those important ones, the ones we're not growing as much here. And so I went to Auburn University, and the only reason I went there, well, I'm glad I did, but it was because they had the highest assistantship, which, you know, a graduate student assistantship is not much, but Auburn offered one of the highest ones, and that's what I took. And then I ended up getting both of my master's and PhD in different departments at Auburn. And then my first real job, academic position, I was assistant professor at Oklahoma State, turf research and teaching. And then from there, I went to Michigan State, and then kind of burned out a little bit from academia, and I had a chance to pursue a kind of a lifelong dream. So I got a job with the United States Golf Association. And so I was an agronomist in the Northeast and helped golf courses with their turf issues for about 8 years. And then sometimes you have to leave something before you realize how much you miss it. And so I was very fortunate, because kind of getting long in the tooth, so to speak, I was able to come back to academia at UCR. So I've been at UCR for 10 years now. Longest I've held any position is here now. So I think this is where I'll be till I retire, hopefully. So that's a little bit about that. Okay, so this is back in my day at the US Open with USGA, and anybody recognize this guy? Yeah, that's Tiger Woods. And anybody recognize this guy? Yeah, so we were at, oh, am I going to lose anybody? Sleep? Yeah, definitely looks better there. But so anyway, we were out checking the green speed, and at the time, I mean, he was in his prime and, you know, hugely popular. He would sneak out on the golf course during the practice rounds, because there were so many people wanted to follow him. And so we had just checked this green, but then we noticed that he was playing this hole, so we decided we needed to go check it again. And so you're not really supposed to talk with the competitors, but he did ask us one question, and he wanted to know what the ball was rolling uphill, not so much downhill. And so, you know, I used to be more proud of this. This was before all the issues, but yeah, that's my little thing here. So with that, you have a book, the California Master Gardener's Handbook, which my good friend Dennis Pittenger put together. Miss Dennis, retired now. Well, all the people I really know well are all retiring or retired. But in addition, back when I was teaching this to undergraduate students, this is a book by Turgeon. So if you're really interested in turf, it's not a big book. It's not written by Baird either. But this is some good information about just a little bit more. It's obviously going to be more than in your handbook, and not too much more. So I think it's certainly something that you can add to your library if you're interested. Okay, so it's a little bit dated now, 2006, but this is a NASA image, and the green depicts how much of the U.S. continental U.S. has turf or had turf. I don't know if we have this much anymore, but one of the things about this is that's about almost 2% of the land area, which is pretty significant. So, if you're a turf guy like myself, you're kind of proud of that fact. And, well, you could say another thing, turf is also the largest irrigated crop, and that could be something to boast about. But then when you don't have a lot of water left, probably is not so much something to be proud of. So obviously, we've had a big target on us. I just walked in. I've been here several times. actually the Western Municipal Water District I pay my water bill to, and they also support us, by the way. But then I look at the wall you've seen out there, and we're kind of told that turf's a bad thing, and so that's why I'm here tonight to hopefully set some things straight with that. But obviously, I mean, plants use water, and turf is no different, but it's not necessarily the culprit either, in my opinion.
Can I ask
So,
a clarifying question?
yes.
When you say turf, I know that there's a lot more green than that in the state of Illinois than Chicago and St. Louis, which were those two big dots. So define turf. Are you talking about under irrigation, golf courses, municipal parks versus, lawns, or what do you mean by turf?
Yeah, and I'll define those a little bit later on, but yeah, I think this is from what I see mainly areas, populated areas where there's lawns. So I think it's more that than grasslands. We're not, because I'll define that, a little bit. I'll differentiate that because there's turf grasses are grasses. Getting ahead of myself here, but we'll talk about the distinguishing features. Yeah. Well, you look at this, and our country is pretty big, so it's kind of on a scale. It's okay. Okay, so I think it's a good thing to talk about, since we tend to hear about all the negative things about turf and lawns, to talk about some of the benefits. And so, one of the things is hello, recreational benefits, and there's obviously from a standpoint of safety, our kids playing sports like soccer, football, etc. I mean, I think there's been a lot of studies that's shown that natural grass, natural turf is a lot safer than artificial turf. Also, especially in California and Southern California, where there is artificial turf, I mean, we're so warm that managers have to actually irrigate artificial turf to keep the temperature down, because the temperatures have been recorded up as high as 180 degrees Fahrenheit near the surface of artificial turf in a hot summer like we have. And so irrigation is necessary. So it's interesting that if someone puts that in because they're thinking they're saving water, then that's an issue. And I agree. I mean, when I lived back east, I'll give you one example where, I mean, I'm not saying that artificial turf is not needed anywhere. I don't know what it's called now, but it was formerly, Giant Stadium. The New York Giants played there. The New York Jets. There was soccer team, MLS soccer. There was college. I mean, that stadium was constant use, and they tried to maintain or sustain natural grass, but that's really difficult to do. So that's one example. So the safety issues, and then the other thing is just, obviously things have changed, but when I grew up, I think many in this room are in the same boat as me. I mean, what did we do for entertainment? We were outside playing. That's what I was doing on the grass, and so I know my kids are not doing that. They're getting other exercise, but they're not out there, and today's generation doesn't seem to be either. But I guarantee one thing: if we get rid of all the turf, we won't have any opportunities like this for our future generations. So there's a lot of recreational benefits, and then there's no denying it. I mean, part of what we do in turf, or a lot of it, is aesthetic related, and there's a lot of these benefits. And one of the things that's really jumped out to me in these last several years when we've had severe droughts is just when you stop taking care of your lawn and landscape, just what that seemingly does to the property value. So again, it's we do we do a lot of what we do is for the looks of it, but I think that's still an important consideration. And then I think most importantly are the environmental benefits, and I'm not going to go through each one of these here, but there's a lot of those that maybe we don't think about as much as we should. You know, the dust prevention, noise abatement. There's been a lot of work that has shown that actually turf is a very effective filter, if you will, for chemicals that are applied, whether they're the chemicals and nutrients or, you know, pesticides. There's a lot of microorganisms, and I'll show you a picture in a moment, in that upper portion of the turf rhizosphere, if you will, and these organisms are able to break down these chemicals quite effectively into benign forms. Obviously, a very important, you know, turf is a plant, a photosynthetic plant, and so this process is important to all of us, obviously. Plants capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and produce sugars, you know, produce their own food, and then evolve oxygen so we can breathe. And so this is an important factor here. And then if you consider just what's going on in terms of climate change, carbon dioxide is one of the greenhouse gases. So plants that are able to photosynthesize and they basically sequester that carbon from the atmosphere into the soil. And because we don't plow up turf on an annual basis, it's there for years and years, we hope, then it's pretty effective at sequestering this carbon dioxide, this greenhouse gas. So this is that kind of upper portion of the root zone I was telling you about. This is kind of, you know, that darkened portion is that organic matter where that carbon is eventually ending up. And so there's a lot of, like I said, you know, this is partially decaying over time, and there's a lot of microorganisms in there, and they're able to you know, to kind of filter out, like I mentioned before, other things that might be going through that root zone. And then probably one of the biggest factors we need to consider about, especially in urban California, right? I mean, we have a lot of people, a lot of urban environments. If we take out all the plants, what's that going to do is going to raise the temperature. And so last time I checked, 2/3 of the energy production in this state requires water. So if we remove the plants, like turf, and then we in essence, heat up the environment, and then we have to cool that environment, and then in order to cool it, at least 2/3 of that energy requires water. So that's something for consideration. And then just the cooling effect. Obviously trees provide that, but turf does as well. Think about when you perspire, and when that perspiration evaporates, how does your skin feel? Cooler. And so turf and other plants are transpiring. They're losing water through evaporation, through transpiration, and that helps to cool the environment. So these things are important. That said, I'm not here to say that we need turf everywhere, and this is one of those silly pictures somebody lent me. I'm not sure where this is, but do we really need that little patch of grass? Maybe it's for the dogs, I don't know, or the pets. I'm not sure, but that doesn't seem to be an area that's really needed. And then I have to get on my soapbox here because the things that I've heard in recent times that, you know, of course we have to take out turf because it's a water pig, and we got to replace it with native or California-friendly type plants. And this is my definition of California friendly. I'm not sure what a California friendly plant is because, when I went to school way back when, Colorado State, I learned that pretty much every turf grass except buffalo, we're going to talk about a lot of species tonight, but buffalo grass is one of the turf grasses. I learned that it's actually native to North America, and the rest of them are more imports. But through more recent genetic testing, most of the grasses I'm going to talk with you about tonight, the turf grasses that we all know, or I think most of you will probably have heard of these, they've been around millions of years. So I ask, how long do you have to live here to be native? And so, be careful about. I mean, there's a lot of this. It's this, California friendly or native. Just because a plant is native doesn't necessarily mean it's drought tolerant. And the thing that I maintain about turf grasses is we've bred turf grasses, bred and developed them over time to survive where? In urban environments. Whereas you want to go out or somebody wants you to go and take a native plant that's out native to grasslands and then try to make it work in an urban environment when we've already been working on that. So that's something to consider as well. Okay, so let's talk about some definitions, just to kind of get on the same page, kind of turf speak, if you will. So this turf grass, a good definition is and contiguous, kind of a fancy word for connecting. So a connecting ground cover that tolerates persistent mowing and traffic. So those are the two key things: being able to be mowed low, fairly low, and to tolerate traffic. And so there's other grasses out there that obviously turf grasses are grasses, but other grasses, if they can't tolerate the low height or the traffic, then they're not really considered turf grasses. And then when we, if you're really a turf guy like myself, then you kind of get a little bit more specific. And when we say turf, we talk. It's not just the plant, but it's also the underlying soil as well. But that's kind of splitting hairs. And then sod, of course, turf harvested. So sod is the plant and the soil harvested for transplanting. And then, of course, there's the different types of turf. The lawn would be more the home lawn. Sports utility be more like roadsides, right-of-ways, that sort of thing. So just some definitions there. And then we could talk about just how we value turf, or what are some things that we measure in terms of what's good or not so good. And so one of the major things, like I said, like we live in turf is largely about aesthetics. So color is very important, and most Americans tend to be, when it comes to turf, we like green, dark green. By the way, what do you think my favorite color is? Green. There you go. I mean, it was meant to be, right? But it's interesting, if you go to Europe, the Europeans like more light green. It's almost yellowish green. I mean, and they breed the turf grasses more for that lighter color, but we Americans tend to like them, the darker green, the better. Density is pretty simple. Number of shoots per area. The denser, the more shoots, the better the turf tends to look. Texture is something that's a little tricky because when you think of the word texture, you think more of how it feels. We talk about texture in the width of the leaf blade. So I'm going to talk about tall fescue, which is kind of king of the lawn grasses, and it's one of those cool season grasses that uses more water than warm season grasses. And tall fescues, at least the older ones, tend to have wider leaf blades, so we call that coarser textured. And then, any golfers here? Oh, no golfers. Well, my example is going to be like a putting green that has those. If you look at a putting green, those leaves are very, very fine, or like the fine fescues, very kind of needle-like blades. Those are fine textured grasses. So that's another one. Uniformity is more the even appearance. That could be due to a lot of things. I mean, you can have weeds that could disrupt the uniformity. You could have a dull mower could disrupt. So a lot of things can disrupt uniformity or make it better. For more athletic fields, I mentioned what we were doing at the U.S. Open there. Smoothness is important for golf and even other athletics. And then three things, and this is, something that's probably, as I recall, probably a question on your exams or whatever. Just the types of growth habit of turf grasses. The bunch type grasses and tall fescue, ryegrass. These are examples of bunch type, and so they send up new shoots from the base. I have a picture to show you probably the next one. And so they're really just growing from that one plant. They're just tillering from that plant. Whereas the other ones produce rhizomes, which are underground horizontal shoots, right? And then stolons are above ground, right? So then the warm season grasses, there's some cool season grasses as well that have like rhizomes, but largely like the warm season grasses tend to have one or both of these. So those are the three types of growth habit. And then functional quality, I'm not going to spend a lot of time because a lot has to do with more sort of athletic field use and I do a lot. I do a lot of my research revolves around golf, but this is like for athletic fields. A lot of these things are important, but not so much to the homeowner. But yield. We don't grow turf for yield, but just knowing how many clippings you're getting is a good function of how maybe the fertility of the lawn is doing. And so that's kind of important just to keep track of, and then so forth and so on. So I think these are pretty self-explanatory or not really that important for this class. And the people that you're going to deal with or the questions you're going to have to answer. So here's that plant, and here's the tillering that's occurring from the bunch type. So you just have another shoot from the base, and of course the rhizomes and the stolons there. And then again, we typically mow turf, fairly regularly, so we don't really get seed heads. But just like if you're trying to identify other landscape plants, right? Flower is really important to identify a particular species, and the same thing with turf, except we just don't often get a chance to look at those. But these are the three main types of inflorescences. Okay, so now we're moving into the real important stuff. And so here's all of our turf grasses. California's amazing. There's a few that I had some experience with that are kind of adapted to really acidic soils like we dealt with down when I lived in Alabama. High rainfall, you have acidic soils like centipede grass, Bahia grass. But outside of that, this is pretty much everything else you can grow in California. So you've got the cool season grasses on the left and the warm on the right, and those temperatures are kind of an air temperature range where it's sort of an ideal range. It doesn't mean that you can't grow cool season grasses outside of that or warm outside of that range, but it's just sort of their ideal temperature range, just to give you an idea. And so you could tell that, well, you just look at the temperatures for the warm season grasses. These grasses were evolved from areas that are much warmer, higher light intensity. And so they've adapted to those types of conditions, and they can do it they can just survive with less water overall. And so one of the things that it's really important take home here is that just this group collectively compared to the left side use at least 20% less water. So, you know, already let's say, I mean, what we have, what most side in, you know, Southern California, I mean, this is the go-to grass. And so just by switching to this, you could save 20% water. And then we're going to talk about ways we can save even more water than that. So I think that's important. So one of the things that I did when I moved here 10 years ago is I switched my lawn, which was tall fescue, just like most everyone else. I switched to Bermuda grass, and I'll explain why I did that when we start going over the grasses here. But it's a considerable savings, and we'll also talk about the main reason I think it's coming up here. Well, let's just deal with it now, and we'll see this later. Is I'll ask the question: why aren't we using? Why are Californians not using the grasses on the right side? They're not as nice looking. Exactly. So that's the thing. And the major one is these grasses, especially, you know, we're cold enough right around here. We're inland far enough that we have considerable frosts, and so it kind of depends on the year, right? But these grasses all go dormant, so they turn brown, and people don't like brown grass. And so that's one of the challenges, and I'm going to address how we're kind of trying to deal with that. You know, and conversely, like in the wintertime, whether we get a little bit or not so much rain, it's cooler, the plant's losing less water, and the tall fescue looks great in the wintertime. The problem is how much water you have to put on it to keep it green in the summertime. So that's a challenge. And so I'm going to tell you about our breeding program that we've kind of resurrected recent times. And we started out kind of working on, okay, let's try to make a cool season grass survive summer with less water. But we really just kind of threw in the towel there and decided, you know what, there's just nothing, whatever the advancements are in these grasses, they don't even come close in terms of water use efficiency to the right side here. So how about let's try to take these and make them stay green in the wintertime. So that's what one of the things I'll show you our progress a little bit later on. And so that's our goal, which is it's a major undertaking you're asking the plant to really, basically you're changing its entire physiology because it's programmed to kind of shut down and protect itself in the wintertime. And so we want to keep it going. And so, but I'll show you how we're trying to overcome that. Okay, so any questions thus far? We're gonna run through, really quick, we're gonna run through the major grasses. I wish I had samples here to show you. That's one thing that need to work on for future classes, because I know it's always good to see these, but I think many of you probably are familiar with most of these. As well. So I start with the cool season side, and we're just going to talk, we're not going to talk about every one of those I just showed you, but kind of the major ones. And so I start with the king of, what I call the king of lawn grasses in California. Pretty much you go throughout the state, and this is the grass that is grown on most home lawns. And how did we get to this point with it? Well, one of the things that it does, at least from the side of drought tolerance within the cool season grasses, is that it has a mechanism called avoidance. So it can grow deep roots, and so it can tap into water a lot, you know, lower in the ground. You know, so when we reach kind of summer, and you know we're not going to get any more rain, and then you know if you have to cut back on irrigation, those roots can tap into that water table a lot lower than a lot of the other grasses. But on the other hand, and I just mentioned the root system, but on the other hand, it takes a lot of water to make it look really good, and that's the problem. And so we deal in research, and I know it's a difficult term for the homeowners to really get their arms around, but we deal with we talk about irrigation in terms of like replacement of evapotranspiration. There's all sorts of weather stations around. Like there's one called the California Irrigation Management Information System, and we happen to have one of the weather stations right on our farm, right near our turf grasses. And so anyone can go into that, and you can get this value, this ET value. It's basically kind of running through these permutations, but it's essentially spitting out a number of like how much water your grass lost, or plants in general, how much water it lost. Like you could figure out how much it lost yesterday, an hour ago. And so we base our irrigation on evapotranspiration. So if you look at like midsummer, you could be losing up to like 2 inches of water a week. And so then we talk about replacing a certain percentage of that to maintain the turf. And so when we talk about that, and I'm sure if you were talking to the homeowners that call you, they're just going to be like, what? I just want to know how long to turn on my irrigation. And I'll talk about that as well, because I'm just going to simplify it there. But I just want you to know that this is how we do. And so to get to that thing, to have a prize-winning tall fescue lawn throughout the summer in Riverside, and I'm also taking into account, and I'll talk about this as well as we go on, is that there's no such thing as a 100% perfect irrigation system, right? So if you take into account the distribution uniformity issues, it's probably like 140%. You've got to replace 140% of what that value was, that ET value. So that's a lot of water. And so that's why we want to talk about other grasses and maybe other approaches here. So yeah, it looks great in the wintertime, but we need to do something better for the summer. It's a bunch type grass. There are some talk about rhizomes, but it's really mostly bunch type. This is one that you're primarily you could buy seed of. You can also buy sod. I mean, most of the sod producers, they're selling tall fescue. But you can seed it, which is always nice because it's cost effective. Mowing's about 2 to 3 inches. It's good shade, traffic tolerance, low thatch. So these are all good attributes for the home lawn, other than the fact that it just does require more water than we have left. And then I talked about texture before, the width of the leaf blade, but there are some advancements. And so if you buy something newer, like what they're called turf type tall fescues, they're pretty fine textured and they look pretty nice. Okay, then the only other one I'm going to talk about in the cool season category is not something you're going to maintain, or those who call you homeowners or what, nobody really maintains a ryegrass lawn unless maybe you're out in the Coachella Valley or you have a warm season turf like in the Coachella Valley, and then you want that green color in the wintertime like everyone wants in the Coachella Valley. So pretty much out there it's Bermuda grass everywhere, and then they overseed with ryegrass in the wintertime or in the fall and through winter. And so now it's just that period of time where the transition is happening from the ryegrass back to the Bermuda grass. And it's not a good thing. I mean, I know it looks great, and also, well, I'm probably going through all this. So overseeding, as I mentioned, athletic fields, and one of the things, if you look on TV and you ever watch baseball or football or whatever, and you see this distinct striping, and all these designs, it's most likely ryegrass because it has the underside of the blade is very shiny, and so the pattern of mowing really kind of creates that reflection, and so it really is what we call stripes really nicely. So that's ryegrass. Another thing is that it's very quick to establish. Under optimal conditions, you get germination in about 3 days or so. Again, it's more bunch type, but there's some propaganda going on out there with new varieties that some have rhizomes. Again, seed. This is primarily seeded. It doesn't have really good sod strength, and like I said, I'm not talking about this so much that we're talking about having a lawn of it, but it is something that's used for overseeding. So yeah, so that's ryegrass. So the reason I show this is we work with all sorts of these programs or consortiums, and these all largely revolve around cool season grasses. But essentially, what we were being asked to do is like to evaluate all of the latest, greatest cool season grasses that have been bred recently, and evaluate them, how well they do under, you know, low rainfall, high heat. And I'll just tell you that despite that there's been advancements made, there's just nothing that comes close to those warm season grasses that I mentioned before. So what we're doing here, this is a little bit dated picture. This was back in 2010. This is in January, and this is obviously kind of a true winter. We haven't had a whole lot of those recently. And so warm season or cool season? Warm season. Cool season or warm season? Cool. So these are examples actually of tall fescue. So this is how tall fescue is looking. But look at the range of brownness, I guess, in these other ones. This is buffalo grass here. One of the things about buffalo is it got a lot of press, or you know, even some studies that were done before my time. Again, I mentioned earlier that buffalo is one of the, well, was long considered before as the true native species, and so some previous studies have shown that we've done, our program has done, and others have done, is like if you were to turn off the water on all the grasses, that, like, let's just say these are all the grasses that we're interested in. If you turned off the water and just, it was a worst case scenario, you just couldn't water anymore, the last grass standing would be buffalo grass. And the reason is it because it has also a drought avoidance mechanism. And what do you think that drought avoidance mechanism is? No, well, not necessarily deep roots, but it goes dormant. So I would joke, because people heard this, and for the first 2 or 3 years that I was at UCR, it was like the most often asked question to me, like extension question, is like, oh, I've heard about buffalo grass, I've got to have it. And then I had to try to explain to the homeowner that, listen, I mean, I don't, you know, it's a warm season grass, so it's going to go dormant in the wintertime, right? And if it's a winter like this. And then I said, well, if you really want something that you're not going to want to water, it'll also go dormant. So you can have perennially brown grass if you want. So I think we've kind of overcome that buffalo thing. I'm not you know, here to say that, you know, you shouldn't plant buffalo, but you know, it does have its issues, and it doesn't use any more or any less water than the other warm season grasses that we're going to go over. It's just that it has this mechanism to, if push came to shove and you just turned off the water, it's going to protect itself better than the other grasses. So then you see, like, these are, I think this is St. Augustine here. This is probably Bermuda. But one of the things I wanted to show you is this grass right here. This is zoysia grass. And anybody from the transition zone, Oklahoma, Kansas here, yeah. So zoysia is very, very popular in those areas. And one of the reasons is it's a warm season grass, but it's a lot colder up there, right? And so it has to tolerate really harsh winters. I mean, snow and freezing temperatures. And so zoysia can do that. And so it's a little better equipped for the wintertime. And then the other thing from our program standpoint, and this is, like I said, back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, early 80s, our breeder, Dr. Youngner, Vic Youngner, he bred this one. This is called De Anza zoysia. And one of the things that he was thinking about even then, just like we are now, is like, well, he's thinking about warm season grasses, but he's also thinking about color retention. And so, unfortunately, like, this is not tall fescue green, but I hope you could see that relative to the other warm season grasses, it's a little bit greener. And so what I'm going to tell you a little bit later on is how we've kind of picked that up and continue to run with it and trying to make make these grasses stay greener in the wintertime because they already have, they're already very good in terms of water use and water use efficiency. That's true. Yeah, that's right. You're right. And yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment. So the first one I'm going to talk about, and this is, this tends to be like one of those things like, a lot of people don't like turf or grass, but then when even you go farther and you mention Bermuda grass, and that's not very well liked either because it tends to be a little bit aggressive. But I want to tell you some good things about it, I guess. So we feel like, especially for golf courses and athletic fields, that it's probably the best adapted grass, warm season grass for California. Now, the homeowner side, that's where we're going right now. And the reason why it's the overall best is just because it's good in a lot of categories: drought, heat, salinity, and this is not so much for the home front, but I mean, there's a lot of golf courses and other facilities that have to use reclaimed water, and so it's very tolerant of that. Good traffic tolerance, recuperative capacity, on a football field and whatnot. So there's a lot of good things about it. It produces rhizomes and stolons. You can get seeded or vegetative types. The mowing, I mean, it's actually used on putting greens out in the desert. 2 inches is kind of the high point. So that's one of the things it's a little bit more challenging to mow with a rotary mower. Not so good shade tolerance, although I've got quite a bit of trees now that have matured, and I have a 98% cover of Bermuda grass on my lawn, so it's not, it can definitely be overcome. The thatch issue, if you've ever walked on a thatchy lawn, it feels like you're walking on marshmallows, and that might not be so bad, but the more thatch, the less water penetration down to the roots, and so you can have a lot of other problems there. So you have to be careful there. And then here's the deal: it is more aggressive, invasive, but it hasn't taken over it's in my landscape beds, I'm going to admit, but it's not like it's taken over them. It's just something you just have to deal with. But I'll tell you, I mean, the 20% plus, I'm going to add on 20 more when I tell you about these other things. I mean, you could easily save 40 to 50% water over what's being done now just by the right grass and the other things I'm going to tell you later on. And so, there's just, you can't convince me that there's like a California-friendly or a native plant that's going to use even less water. I mean, yeah, there's the desert plants, yeah, I get, but, I kind of laugh when I see, especially I live in Riverside, could have ridden my bike here, not that far away, but when I've seen this like turf removal and then the other plants going in, it's like, really? And this is going to use less water? This is one to think about, and again, it's not the perfect, maybe the perfect grass for the lawn, but I did the poor man's approach, and there are some nice seeded types, and so it's cheaper, it's easier to seed your lawn than it is to have, buy sod and have that, you have to prepare that and, you prepare the area. And so, I definitely, I would have probably chosen some other species I'm about to tell you about, but I went with the seeded, or the Bermuda because there's some good seeded types. You had a question?
Yes. What exactly is thatch?
So thatch is just partially decomposed organic material. So it's just kind of, some of it's alive, dying, dead, and these grasses that tend to produce rhizomes and stolons that just, it's mostly above ground, and the fact that they're very aggressive and they grow a lot in the summertime. I mean, these grasses love the heat. I mean, my lawn, it's almost end of April. My lawn really hasn't woken up yet. It's green. The Bermuda's green, but it hasn't I'm mowing it, but it's not taken off yet. It doesn't really wake up around here until about May. And so, but when it does, you got to keep up with it because I'm not saying you have to mow more than once a week, but sometimes I feel like I should with that. So that's kind of what that is. Another question? Oh, so vegetative type means that that the particular cultivar, there's no viable seed, doesn't produce any seed, so you have to sod it, so it can be grown as sod, or sometimes you can use plugs, and you just space those, you plant them in the soil, and then eventually that's going to grow together. Or another one is the stolons. You can actually take a plant and take the stolons and plant them, kind of disperse them, and as long as you water frequently enough, because if you don't, they're going to dry out, you can do what was called stolonization. Or another one that, just in case it's in your book, called sprigging, which is taking that stolon and with a specialized machine and kind of planting it partially in the soil so you get some water contact. And so those are all examples of vegetative propagation. So there's no seed, no seed available.
Is that the hybrid then?
Yes, like a lot, yeah. And actually, now that I'm involved very much so in a breeding program. I mean, I'm not a geneticist by background, but I mean, what I've learned since then is there's a lot of hybrid Bermuda grasses, and these are the ones that tend to look the best, the finest texture, the best density, but there's no seed available. But actually, if you allow them to flower, that's not necessarily the case. My geneticist colleague tells me that there's actually some that are viable, but certainly not for seed production and to allow us to go buy enough seed to establish our lawns. Question?
Remember when they used to come out and dye your Bermuda grass green when it went brown?
Yeah, and that's interesting because we haven't. There's been some great advancements made with colorants, is what the industry likes to call them, and but California in general has not grasped onto that. If you go to the southeastern U.S., where there's pretty much all warm season grasses, but yet they're cold enough to go dormant for sure, they don't even overseed anymore, and they kind of laugh at us. I mean, some of my colleagues back there is like, "What do you guys? I mean, you guys are you don't have any water. What are you doing, overseeding all your turf?" And they paint everything, and so but it hasn't really grasped on because it's more artificial. But I'll tell you, some of these colorants, I've done a study. I don't know if I have it at the end of this presentation. I've done a study where we've compared some of those, and I was quite surprised how good they look. You just have to make sure you don't get them on your sidewalk, because there's a differentiation between we call them paints, but the coloring industry calls them pigments with resin versus pigments. And so the pigments with resin, I don't know if I have this, but if I do, you'll get a good laugh out of it. If I don't, I'll mention it now. So we were doing this study, and we're doing it all around the state. So one of the things I just decided to use my lawn as one of the research areas. And so I was getting a lot of questions from people about, well, what happens if you get it on your sidewalk or if you get it on the cart path of the golf course? And so without telling my wife, I proceeded to spray all the different colorants. We were using like 12 or 14. And we have an RV parking area. We don't have an RV, never will, but we have this big area, and I sprayed them, and it took literally, I'm not kidding, for those paints, pigments with resin, it was like a good 3 to 4 years before they finally faded. So it's definitely something you want to wash off quickly. And then the other thing about that is, the only thing that I did hear about or is when a couple of years ago when we were in the really serious drought area. I mean, it's kind of hard to keep them all separate, right? But there were a lot of these startup companies, and they were calling me, and I thought they were wanting to let's go paint warm season grasses and keep them green. No, they wanted to paint dead turf because people were not watering their lawn anymore and just keeping keeping it green. And so that kind of came and went. Yes, is there a comment? Okay, that's Bermuda. So then here's some cultivars, and so on the seeded side, I mentioned these hybrids. The question was raised about the hybrids, which are more the vegetative types, like here. So these are all of if you looked at these, if I showed you all of these, all separate plots, I'm pretty sure you could pick out all of these they're just the best looking ones. Their density, their texture. But I'll tell you the closest one to this side is Princess 77. So if you were looking to go that route, I would suggest that one. It's and again, that's one of the reasons why I went with Bermuda, as I'm about to show you with these other species, because there's no seed choices for those other ones. You have to do it vegetatively. So here's some of those. Okay, so let's talk about zoysia. This is, like I mentioned, the transition zone, so it's a little bit better adapted for cooler weather, therefore it can stay a little bit greener. The one thing that we don't like as much, because we are concerned about water, is if you have Bermuda besides zoysia and you start cutting back the water, and now we're talking about, like, we've already saved 20%, right, because we're using the right grass. But now if you just compare two grasses within the warm season, you're looking at, the zoysia is not going to, it's going to be unhappier with less water. Also rhizome stolons, seeded vegetative types. Mowing can tolerate low to fairly high. This has good shade tolerance. This is one I really wanted for the lawn, my lawn. But it's just one of those things that let's see here. There's just the good type, there are seed available, but I'm talking about very, very slow. I would never, ever recommend to anyone to plant a seeded zoysia, because it would literally, I'm not kidding, it would take you 3 years to have a lawn. It's just really, really slow. So you have to go the vegetative route. And it's pretty tough. Somebody mentioned about we talked about coarseness. This time into the feel, it tends to feel a little rougher than in some of the other grasses. But it's tough. It's tougher. But if you put it on a football field, let's say, it's going to get beat up eventually, and then it's going to be hard to recover from. Whereas Bermuda grass is going to be a lot easier to recover. So zoysia, I showed you De Anza before. Again, this is one that you can't buy seed of. You can only buy sod or these other ways of establishing. But the winter color, that was one of the reasons why it was developed. El Toro also came from our program way back in the day, and faster is a relative term. It's not much faster, but that was one of the things about it. And then some of these other ones are more kind of newer types. But if you want to, if you can invest in sod, I think this is a really good lawn grass because it has good shade tolerance overall. Okay, any Floridians here or visitors to Florida? This is the go-to lawn grass of Florida, St. Augustine grass, and we have some. I'll be driving around Riverside or anywhere, Southern California. You occasionally run into it, and when we talk about texture here, it has wide leaf blades. However, those are really soft, though, very soft to the touch. They're just but the texture is wider, and whoops, what did I just do? Sorry. So common lawn grass of Florida, coarse textured, rhizome stolons. It has good shade tolerance, probably the best among all the warm season grasses, and I think, there's not a lot of, there are trees in Florida too, so they do, I think maybe one of the reasons why it's used. Yeah.
Will Bermuda grass take over St. Augustine grass?
Yeah, yeah. Bermuda will take over. Yeah. Well, I haven't got to kikuyu grass yet. That's the one that will take over a lot of things. But yeah, yeah. So I have a friend who I was trying to help. He has kind of a mixed St. Augustine and Bermuda grass. And talk about uniformity, because you have this grass that has really wide leaf blades, and then Bermuda grass relative to that, or anything relative to St. Augustine, is not going to look like that. So, so yeah, I just put it up here. It's not really what I'd recommend, but you do see some out there that, you know, if you contacted a sod producer, I think each one of them has at least one variety. Yes?
I grew up with that grass, and I've lived in Riverside 30-some years, and I've always had St. Augustine.
Yeah.
It's great. You mow the last time in October, and then you don't have to mow.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. I just mowed around where the sprinklers were. It kind of
Yeah.
started growing.
Yeah.
I just mowed like
Yeah.
last week for the first time since October.
Yep. That's one of the things about, again, another reason for these grasses. But the unfortunate thing is, I mean, I still mow my own lawn. I always will. I've solved a lot of the world's problems out there on that, on that mower. But the thing is, it's funny that most of my neighbors have gardeners, and I don't know if they just want to help them out or whatever, but they're just mowing and blowing like every week. I'm like, what are you mowing? Even when I had tall fescue, I stopped mowing. You know, if it was a colder winter, the fescue's not even growing. So, yes?
You may be getting to this later, but how do you recommend dethatching St. Augustine?
Okay, I'll give you two approaches. My approach, I like the poor man's approach, because mine is, so I'm mowing my lawn with a rotary, and again, it's like these warm season grasses, well, except maybe St. Augustine, they all really prefer to be mowed by a reel mower, but we just can't. I mean, you could buy a reel mower, but that's more expensive and just more hassle. So I just have my rotary like pretty much everyone else. And so when my Bermuda, let's say, gets unruly, and typically the reason it gets unruly is there's times of the year that I'm more concerned about the turf, the 10 acres of turf I have at UCR, and I get behind or I'm traveling and I don't mow as often, and then it gets thatchy, and then what I've got to do is just scalp it down. And so the one thing to do, and what I do is so you know, you start lowering the height of cut, and then you got to do it gradually, because your mower's just going to keep bogging down and stopping. So I just try to take it down, which is it's a lot of walking and a lot of mowing, and then there's still going to be a lot of debris. But I just, instead of trying to even just pick it up and put it in the green basket, I just keep mowing it, and then it just blow the debris kind of back in. I know that's sort of like take away that puffiness, and then you just let it grow back. Now the other approach is you could go to one of the rental places and just rent what it's called a dethatcher, or a vertical mower. And so these blades are they're flat, and they spin around and they go into the ground. You could set it how deep, and then it pulls a lot of that debris up. And so that's probably much more effective, but then you have to do something with that debris. You usually have to rake it all up, and it's a lot of green waste. But like I said, I've been able just to get by with just using my mower, and then the lawn's not going to look so good. It's going to kind of go brown because of all the scalping, but then it just greens up pretty quickly, and that's probably the best way to deal with that.
Is there any particular time of year to do that?
Well, one of the things I try to do two things, and I don't always do it at this time, but the two times I guess would be somewhat helpful. And as one is like you think about like you're going into dormancy anyway, so you could take that opportunity to just like, okay, I'm going to send it in a little bit earlier and just take care of my thatch. And then the other thing is to get it when, in spring, like now, when it's just starting to grow, because that will also help it green up. I mean, it's not going to look good right after, but it'll help it gets more, you get more sunlight to that soil surface, and you kind of get things rolling there. So those are the 2 times I would do it. But I mean, there have been times I've done it, in the middle of summer, just because I didn't like the fact that, I don't like walking across that puffiness. So. Okay, so St. Augustine cultivars, these are some, and again, like I said, it's not, if you go to probably the major sod producers, they're going to have at least one variety, but it's not like, they sell a lot more tall fescue still. Unfortunately, they sell a lot more Bermuda and other types of grasses than St. Augustine, but it's there.
Hey, will that Bermuda take over zoysia grass?
Yeah, it's more aggressive. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I said. It's one of those ones that, unfortunately, like the best seeded type, and like I like to do things as cheaply as possible. So it's unfortunately, like one of the best seeded types of the warm season grasses is the Bermuda. That's why I said that it's not perfect. But here's another one.
What is it about crabgrass that Bermuda won't take over?
Well, crabgrass will inhabit Bermuda or any other turf. Whoops.
Is it a matter of the seed production? I read once if you pulled one out, it's not recommended because 5,000 seeds would go all over the place. 5,000, that seems ridiculous.
Yeah, well, species like weeds are pretty. That's one of the reasons why they're weeds. They're very good at reproducing and scattering. But we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to weed control. But here's another choice, and I just realized I misspelled this or left out an S. So it's the seashore paspalum, so this is the correct spelling of this. So the one thing about seashore paspalum, when it's in its prime, and we have some at our farm, and when we've had kind of just the casual observer come out to our farm, it's almost like it's a magnet. I mean, people are drawn to that. It's beautiful emerald green grass, very appealing, very similar to Bermuda grass in terms of looks. But one of the things that we just, again, goes back to this. I mean, it's not just recently. A major focus of our program since the beginning of the program has been about water, because, this is the climate we're in, right? And so we're going to have droughts.
Is this a summer grass or a winter grass?
This is also the warm season. We're on the warm season side. So I just showed you a couple of examples of cool season. So now we're doing all the warm. But so it's not as drought resistant. It just seems to require a little bit more attention. But you can get some seeded types. So there's been a number of homeowners that have contacted me in the last several years, and ones who just said, I don't want to totally get rid of my lawn. I mean, I want to do the right thing and I want to save water, but I don't want to get rid of it. And so we talked about, well, really you should be thinking about warm season grasses. So a lot of them went to this because they just weren't really, that Bermuda grass that has that stigma. I mean, or just, it is what it is. It's kind of aggressive. I mean, this could be as well, but maybe not so much. But like I said, it's just not as drought tolerant, and it just kind of seems to require more inputs, if you will, like more mowing, I don't know, it's hard to put my finger on it. It's just something that, it's just not going to replace Bermuda grass in my estimation. But, and this is not really an issue for us homeowners. We don't deal with recycled water. We have good water, right? But for those golf courses and athletic facilities or schools or whatever, whoever's on bad water, really salty water, almost to this like seawater-ish, I mean, this grass can withstand it. So I haven't been to Hawaii in a number of years since I was in high school, but from what I understand, like most of the golf courses in Hawaii now are wall-to-wall seashore paspalum. And that shows you the advancements made. Because when I was a student, this was like a weed, and they just through breeding have developed all these great seashore paspalums. And like I said, if you if you see it in its prime, it is a beautiful grass, but it's just more maintenance. Not so good cold tolerance, but that's not really too much of an issue in most parts of the state.
Is that grass in California?
Yeah. So, and here's the types. So there's not as many seeded types, but one is called sea spray. There's a few others that have come down. I need to update this, but yeah, there's choices here. So I'd say that really, in my opinion, so what we've seen thus far, I mean, I still like Bermuda, even though it has issues. Zoysia, if you could sod, but seashore paspalum would be another one to consider as well. And so we'll talk buffalo, native. Now this is the other thing about buffalo. It's, if you're looking for this really, if you're used to like tall fescue and this beautiful emerald green, turf, buffalo grass is more open, less dense. It's blue at best, bluish green in color, and so it's just more of a kind of flowing type of thing. It's, it has stolons. It's dioecious. What's that? That's a botanical term I'll throw out there. Anybody know what dioecious means? There you go. Yeah. The male and female flowers are on separate plants. And so we have seeded and vegetative types. Unfortunately, it's a lot of the seeded types, they've developed like a University of Nebraska is a big breeding program for buffalo. And so it's native to the North American Great Plains. And they've developed a lot of seeded types, but they're not as well adapted as here. And we have one called UC Verde, which was developed at Davis and Riverside. And that actually its heritage is more from Mexico. And so it's much better adapted for our climate. And the thing about it is buffalo grass in general has very poor sod strength. Like there's almost no sod produced. And even more so, with UC Verde, you have to plug it. And so that was one of the things I was thinking about too when I was converting my lawn, and I was new and I didn't want to try to cash in any favors that I didn't have, right? So, and when I looked into like how much it was going to cost me to plug UC Verde, I mean, it's like, that's crazy. That's like several $1,000s to. I mean, I love grass, but I do draw the line there. So, but low input, and as I mentioned before, it's important to know it doesn't use any less water than the other warm season grasses. It just has this mechanism, this dormancy mechanism. If you just cut the water back completely. And so UC Verde, if you're going to go with it, I would do that, even though it's kind of pricey. There is one that came out. We evaluated it called Sundancer. I mean, it's not as good as UC Verde, but it is a seeded type. And then I think my last one here is Kikuyu, and this is one that this grass was introduced in the 1920s for soil stabilization, and then it just sort of took off. And it's basically really only in California. There's a lot of it in Hawaii. There's a little bit in Arizona, but it came from California, from the sod. And so it's very aggressive, invasive. It's considered a noxious weed. But it's also been here long enough that it's become very well adapted to courses. And I was walking around the UCR campus yesterday because we were in search of an area to do some weed control work. And I knew we had Kikuyu, but pretty much our entire campus, all the grass you see if you walk at UCR is Kikuyu. That's how it's just taken over. And so stolons, rhizomes, they're seeded and vegetative types, but basically just one, and it's more of like a forage type. And so there's a lot of room for improvement with this. And so this is also one of the things that we're looking at because of that. This last point, is that it has what we're looking for already. It has the best winter color, but it has other issues. So we need to calm it down because it's very, very aggressive. We don't have to work on the color as much as just the aggressiveness.
What
Yes.
is the N, nitrogen?
Yeah, N, you're right. Low N requirement, doesn't require as much nitrogen. So any questions about those? I know I went through kind of quickly.
Is there a reason St. Augustine grows so well in Florida? I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with the water table or moisture from the.
I'm not sure exactly why that kind of became the grass. I mean, they're obviously sandier soils. It might be something with the soils. Obviously, the climate.
What about this one? Is it all over California? Or is
Kikuyu is primarily coastal, but also inland. I mean, it prefers the closer you go to the coast and more southern areas. That's kind of its niche. It doesn't like the desert. You'll hardly see any in the desert. It doesn't, although it evolved from a kind of a higher elevation area. You don't really find it in really colder, going up to the Sierras or any higher elevations around here. But yeah, it's like more coastal. We find it. It's up in San Francisco Bay Area, but there's not as much up there as there is down here. And so we're trying, and I'll talk about this a little bit. This is actually one of the grasses we're trying to improve, believe it or not, because it is a challenge. I mean, I've written, part of my research money comes from the government, the experiment station, and I remember when I wrote, you have to write like a long-term grant to justify the money you're getting, and so I wrote, when I first arrived here, I wrote that I was working on this grass, and of course I didn't think anybody read these things anyway, but apparently they do, and they kicked it back to me, and they rejected it because they said we're not supporting work on a federally noxious weed, and so. But my point is that it's here to stay. We're not going to get rid of it. It's extreme. I mean, and not a lot of golfers here, but I'm sure you've heard like Riviera Country Club, La Jolla Country Club, La Cumbra in Santa Barbara. These are all golf courses where it's pretty much wall to wall except for the greens, all kikuyu, and they manage it. And it's some of the most beautifully managed turf. But what we tend to see is more of like just that, it just gets everywhere we don't want it to be. Yes?
So I'm curious because if you've been researching, the book says it's from Africa.
Yeah, from Africa.
So I'm just kind of curious, because when I visualize Africa, it's either inland, desert, or grasslands that come and go with the rains. So I'm just curious if it was imported from there, if it straight to California, or if it made its way from the east to the west.
No, it was, like I said, it was brought specifically for soil stabilization. Kind of like, anybody spend time in the southeast? Kudzu, anybody heard? I mean, that was sort of a similar type thing. There's a lot of examples of plant material that were brought in for certain purposes, and then they were just got away from us. And so, yeah, this was one of those situations that, it's from Kenya, I believe. I would love to go and kind of go back to the origin, but it's a little bit higher elevation. But yeah, it was brought in, and like I said, it's here to stay. So, I'll help you get rid of it if you want. But I mean, I'm more interested in trying to make it better. Yes. It will if it's cold enough. But like I said, like this winter was a crazy winter. I mean, we didn't really go dormant when we're supposed to, like, late December, early January. And then we're thinking like nothing's going to happen. And then all of a sudden winter arrives in late February and March. And so but through all this, our kikuyu did not go dormant at all. The Bermuda did, the zoysia and the other warm season grasses did, but not the kikuyu. And that's why I'm so interested in it, because again, it's in that realm of it's a warm season grass, so you're talking, it's like instant 20% savings of water, and then we go from there. So another question? Yes.
Yeah. So in a hot place like Riverside, what grass does the best? We have a lawn. It has trees and has no trees. So what grass transitions well from your hot sunny areas to under trees or anything? One that will do it, or is it a mix of a couple, or?
I mean, are you talking like, is it really deep shade, or
It's deep shade.
I mean, is it getting like at least 2 or 3 hours of sunlight, or is it just nothing?
Maybe like first thing in the morning and last thing in the afternoon.
Okay. Well, I mean, it sounds like it could be a tall order for some of these other. I mean, like I said, the ones I've talked about thus far, the best shade tolerance are St. Augustine and zoysia. But if you're talking really deep shade, one of the things that, I mean, we don't have enough time to probably discuss it in more detail, but we've always talked about this concept in the past of maybe having like a mixed stand. So where you would have, if you have this, let's say you have this tree that it's very valuable, and so but it's deep shade, then you would probably just try to maintain your cool season grass underneath that, and then have the warm season grasses in the other area. And I know it's not, the two don't always blend together real well, and certainly when the one goes dormant, it's really going to kind of stick out. But that's a possibility as something to think about. Okay. Okay, so we're kind of moving more into the management now, I think. But I just want to talk about like the differences between these grasses in terms of growth. So here's the warm season down here. So they're just, like I said, waking up right now, and then loving life in the middle of summer. Whereas in terms of both shoot and root growth, and then the cool season ones are, like spring, there's a lot of shoot growth going on, roots, but then in the summer things take a dive, and it's amazing, dealing with some of these grass, especially like on putting greens in the summertime. We've done some work, and you look at what seems like a perfectly fine stand of grass, and this is a cool season grass, but underneath the root system is compromised because of the heat, and so you have to be careful. A lot of times bad things happen to cool season grasses in this period, especially when you're intensively managing them. But then it's going to have a resurgence in the late fall. For us, it's going to be a little bit later. I mean, it took me a while living in all these other places. I used to think like Labor Day, fall's in the air. Not here. It's just starting. Halloween, I feel like fall is in the air. So yeah, it's gonna, this is gonna be more around Halloween, and then you get that back. So it's good to keep these kind of things in mind. And so I guess that leads us to the establishment. The best times to establish, let's just say if we're still going with tall fescue, for example, a good time, and this is kind of Riverside, but just largely Southern California for the most part, around October 15th would be a good, it's still warm, but it's like we're on the verge of cooling off, maybe getting some rain as well. Vegetatively, sod, you better do it earlier, better get it done by June. Typically we have a pretty mild June, but not last year. Last June was just like July or August, and or then wait till later on in the year, October, November, and then the warm season ones. You want to sow the seed or plug, sod, sprig. Keep in mind those calendars or this thing I showed you here is most of the growth is happening during the summer. So you want to start a little bit later with those, but you don't want to get started too late, like wait till too much after August, because you just don't give enough time to get things established. But that said, I mean, warm season grasses are pretty tough in general. So, I've seen like on golf courses them sod dormant turf basically, and it's going to survive. But it's not something we really want to do ideally. And then fertility practices, let me explain this a little bit because it could be a little confusing. So one of the things that I think is very important practice, and I think this is coming up here in my presentation, is to talk about tips for saving water besides just having the right grass. And one of the tips is to feed your lawn. This is one of the major things that I see homeowners not do, is they of course they have the gardener mow and blow all year, but I never see any fertilizer going down. How do you feel when you don't eat for quite a while? So imagine, the turf, and so I can always tell a lawn that hasn't been fed at all. It's very weedy, very thin, and so that's kind of like my whole neighborhood. I don't think anyone feeds their lawn. So that said, what I'm talking about here is 4 different times. And when you would fertilize, if you read the bag of fertilizer you get, and there's all sorts of ones, the tendency is the bag is going to tell you, like, okay, this bag treats this amount of square foot area. But if you did the calculations, like depending upon what the NP and K is, you're putting about a pound of N of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet when you make an application from the bag. And so this is equivalent to any one of these times is like doing that, putting that pound down. And so what I'm saying here is if you have a cool season grass and you're only going to do it one time, I would do it, my priority would do it around Halloween. That would be number 1 priority. So, and I tell you, doing it one time is better than pretty much all the lawns I've seen, which is nothing ever. And so, but if you want to have it a little bit nicer for the cool season, let's add St. Patrick's Day in there as number 2, as the second time we're going to do this. Then we'll just keep, so we got Halloween here for warm. And why do I have Halloween? Why do you think I chose Halloween? I mean, we talked about it finally cooling off. But one of the things about, especially for the warm season grasses, we call this more like late season fertilization. It's going to help your warm season grass stay greener longer. So we're trying to do it genetically. I'm going to show you in a moment. But this is going to help. And so the cool season side is the turf isn't going to go dormant, but the plant is slowing down, it's getting cooler, and it's sending a lot of those carbohydrates it's making in photosynthesis, it's sending down to the roots, and the nitrogen is going to help it at that time. So we've got those 2, and then if we want to add a third one, which I just want 1, just give me 1, okay? Just to do number 1, and maybe number 2, but if you want to be lawn of the year in your neighborhood, then you start talking about 3 and 4. And so for warm season, Labor Day, 4th of July, and then Memorial Day, Labor Day. I just try to do it think about a holiday.
Is this feed only? No weed feed, just feed?
This would be, I'm talking about nutrients, but yeah, that's a good question because, and I have a little component on weed control, but yeah, you're right. I mean, companies like Scott's, they're trying to help you out there, so all-in-one type thing. So we could talk about that, and you can kind of see how those would mix as well. But this is just like I'm saying, if I wanted to have the best lawn in Riverside, I would fertilize 4 times a year. If I want to have anything less than that but still good, I'm going to feed 1 to 3 times. And it just, for me, it's like I do it at least once. Sometimes I do it twice if I remember. Because I tell you, I've got like more than 10 acres and growing. When you have a breeding program, it's like the land just keeps expanding. But so oftentimes I'm more worried about the turf at UCR than I am at home, but this is kind of the thing here. So, but the take-home message is like feed your lawn. I mean, it's going to be so much better, and it's going to look better with less water, for sure. It's definitely going to do that. I remember when we moved to Pennsylvania, when I started with the USGA, there was no irrigation. Nobody had irrigation because they typically get enough rainfall. Well, then we had a drought period, and I remember the only thing I was doing in my neighborhood was fertilizing my lawn, and no one else was. And I just remember the striking difference in terms of how much greener it was, and the only thing that was happening is I was giving it some food. So remember that, okay? Yeah.
Fertilizers, do they pretty much cover what a basic lawn would need, or would you recommend a soil analysis? Is that a waste of money? I've heard
Well, I mean, I think if there's an issue, if there's something going on with the lawn, or let's say that doesn't make sense, it's not, you can't attribute it to the dog or it's just not something like that, then you just, it looks like it could be, oftentimes I haven't really seen a lot of nutrient issues in my time on lawns. I know they exist. I'm not saying they don't, but but in general, like that, what I try to do is, that analysis. So it's N, P2O5K, those three numbers. Most of what your lawn needs is just the N, the first one. But to be on the safe side, sometimes I'll use a complete one time, and maybe the other one will just be nitrogen. But mainly, it's nitrogen. Nitrogen is critical, the most critical. Phosphorus and potassium. Phosphorus, maybe, it's often involved with root development, and so it's often you probably read about, well, maybe if you're establishing a new lawn, you might want to put some more phosphorus in. But I think most of our soils, if it's been around, if it's been under turf, it's probably has enough, of the essential nutrients, and so you're just giving it that extra boost with nitrogen.
Can you buy just nitrogen for your lawn?
Yeah, and one of the cheapest ones would be like urea. It's 4600. You could tell from that, yeah.
Liquid or pellet?
Pardon? Oh, okay. Or, I mean, ammonium sulfate is another one. That's 21. Now you don't find too much ammonium nitrate anymore, since that could be used for other things. But anyway, okay, so we're on to herbicide practices. So the best way to deal with weeds are to get them as they emerge. And so we call that pre-emergence. They're not really, pre-emergence herbicides aren't really preventing germination, but they're forming this barrier in the soil. And then when you don't even see it, these weed seedlings are germinating and growing up, and they contact that barrier and die. And so for the summer annuals like crabgrass, goosegrass, there's a whole slew of broadleaves as well. For us in these neck of the woods, I like January to February, probably more like early February. And then the winter annuals that are going to show up more like in December or so when the rains come, you need to get to them a little bit earlier, so around August to Labor Day. And so make sure with pre-emergence herbicides, you have to water them in. So they have to be irrigated for them to kind of activate. And so I've listed like 3, and these are more like professional turf trade names, but if you look at any label, these are like the common names. It's kind of like the scientific name of a plant, right? We could call, I can't remember, I think they call Bermuda grass couch grass in Australia, if I'm not mistaken. But it's Cynodon is this genus. Everybody knows it as that. So prodiamine, dithiopyr, and pendimethalin, you're going to find that on the label, and those are the top ones there. I just give you an example of one of these problematic ones, nutsedge. These are several That's a toughie because it's so first of all, it's not a grass. It's in the sedge family, but it has these underground nutlets, these tuber type things, and so that's a lot of storage to regenerate. And so I've listed a number of herbicides which you want to do more late because it goes back to later in the season. The plant's kind of slowing down and it's sending a lot. Most all plants are sending all those photosynthates and whatnot, sending it down to the root system. Well, if you apply herbicides during that time, it's going to do the same thing. You want it to go down to the tubers because a lot of these, you might say, well, wow, this is great. My sedge is gone, but then it comes back from those, regenerates from the tubers. So it's at least 2 applications, and it's a process. You might have to do it the following year. Yeah. If you get on a program where you use, you've got quite a bit of weeds, after a couple of years of using pre-emergence, it's not like you have to use it every year. You'll get to a point where you exhaust the weed seed population in the soil, and then it's not like you will never have to use them again, but you should go through a period of time where you have some well-fertilized turf that's managed properly. That's kind of the best herbicide against just a good, well-managed, dense turf to keep the weeds out. Okay, so then let's talk about irrigation practices. So this is that slide I showed earlier, as you can grow in California. This is obviously during summer. These are the fine leaf fescues here, which a lot of them we don't mow. If you go to Northern California, it's sort of their go-to kind of drought-tolerant grass. But it's really tough in Southern California unless you have really shaded conditions. It likes dry shade. But in the open sun, obviously this is getting a lot of irrigation. So this is, like these grasses are getting, at this time, they're getting what they need and to look really good. So,
Baird grass, did you just talk about? Is that
which one?
what they call Baird grass? Yeah.
Well, there's a group of them. There's several species, but they're collectively called the fine leaf fescues. It's almost like needle-like leaves.
You don't mow it, right?
You can mow them, but they also look nice unmowed.
Okay.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, okay, this is obviously great, and this is, you're going to have the best looking lawn. However, we're in a drought and we're running out of water, and so we can have still those same benefits that I mentioned at the beginning. Whoops. I was waiting, I was anticipating another slide here, but I guess it's coming shorter. So let me jump off to here. So this is the ET I was telling you about. So this is a little bit dated now, but if you look at like Riverside, 56 inches of water a year lost in evapotranspiration. And in general, and I was telling you, bless you, I was telling you tall fescue, if you take into account the irrigation system and everything, replacing 140% of that's a lot of water. And so look at how much water's lost in the desert there. So, so in general, what we've developed are these, we call them crop coefficients, which is essentially just the percentage of that ET that you have to replace. So you take for example, you take whatever that is for January, let's say 2 inches of water lost, and then you're just replacing for cool season, you're replacing, roughly 60% in January, but look at close to 100% in the summertime. So that's the complicated thing, but just to make it simplified, in general, we tend to say like the cool season grasses require 80% replacement of ET. And the warm season, that 20% less would be 60%. So, and then you could take into a precipitation as well, which we don't get. When's the last time we got this kind of rain? I mean, I don't think I've ever lived, in 10 years we haven't had 10 inches, I don't think. So now we want to talk about, that was the slide I was looking for, managing grasses, what we call deficit irrigation. So we're giving them less water than I guess would be considered ideal, but still enough to have most of the benefits that we mentioned earlier. I mean, again, it's not ideal. It's not as good as that initial picture I showed, which was non-limiting conditions, but this is just an example of that. So when we talk about you have the right grass, you'd save 20%, and then you do the right things, you could probably knock off 10 to 20% more just by deficit irrigating, as opposed to just giving it everything it needs. And so when you start thinking about these things, I don't think turf grasses are necessarily, water wasters. I thought I had this slide that maybe it's coming. I'll just wait till it might come. But the other thing is just, well, I think it's going to come right after this. And this is just an example of maybe where you might not want to have turf, just because it's the difficulty in irrigating that area and not, water going everywhere else but the plant. Maybe I didn't put this in here, but it's a good thing to say here. I had it in bold print before, but my point is, turf grasses don't waste water, people waste water, and faulty irrigation systems waste water. So that's where I'm leading into next with sort of my list here of irrigation practices. So we need to start by monitoring the irrigation system, and this is where you have to spend a little bit of time. But I think that your manual, I hope it does, would go over how you can measure DU or just look at things. I mean, for me, the simple approach is you turn on your system and you watch it, and you make sure everything's functioning correctly. But what's going to happen when you don't have good DU over time is you're going to get these brown areas, and most likely because of poor distribution. So one of the things that we want to try to avoid, the lazy thing to do is just turn up your irrigation system to account for that poor distribution. Or you water more frequently, or you just water, you increase the run times, and so we're wasting more water. We're just to get that one little area brown, we're putting way too much water every place else. And so unfortunately, because most homeowners have this controller and they don't, it's a scary thing to them, they don't want to touch it. What I find is, again, we go back to the gardener sets it up, and the gardener wants to keep their job, so the gardener wants to give them green grass. And so my approach is, what I do is I try to deficit irrigate. I try to give the turf barely what it needs for the most of the lawn, and I most certainly have distribution issues. And when I see those, what I'll do is once a week I'll go out, I'm in the yard, and just trying to take care of everything else, and I'll just take the hose and I'll hand water those dry spots. And usually that's enough to make up for that week where it's just not, or previous time that it's not getting enough water. So that's a way to save water as opposed to increasing the water every place else. So hand water those dry spots. Irrigate, I mean, it's not so critical. You probably read in a lot of literature about when you should irrigate. I think in more humid climates, it's obviously early morning is the best, because if you have a lot of humidity and you have let's say you irrigate it in the afternoon or evening, or let's say late afternoon, early evening, then there's a lot more water sitting around, and there's a lot more disease that can develop. But we're so dry, it's not really that important. So what I do is I start my run times or my irrigation around midnight, and then I always try to set the last one when I'm up in the morning, so I can see that the irrigation system has been running. And most of the time I can even see, I mean, I don't go out and check every zone in the morning, but at least I could tell if there was something went wrong, I could probably detect that. Okay, here's the deal. You know, I talked about all these complex things, and you know, when you talk to the homeowner, I don't think they want to really discuss or want to know about evapotranspiration and whatnot, and crop coefficients and things. So here it is. I don't know any lawn, there's no turf that I mentioned previously tonight that requires irrigation 7 days a week. It doesn't need it, absolutely not. And unfortunately, what I've seen living in this state for now is just that irrigation tends to happen every night. And just because the homeowner doesn't really understand what's in that box, they don't want to touch it, and so they just let it go. And so the unfortunate thing, you know, as we reach these severe droughts and whatnot, and you know, just I guess the state had to identify someone or something, and so it just became turf as the culprit. But you know, why didn't we start? My question is, why didn't we start? Which is some of these things we're discussing. I mean, the right grasses, the right way to irrigate, you know, fertilize, and I mean, we can have a considerable savings of water. But no, it went from having lawns to just taking out, you know, and spending $40 billion for people to, you know, take out their lawn so our environment can heat up and spend more energy to cool it, that sort of thing. So, but here, I get back to this. Lived here 10 years, had tall fescue for at least 2 of them, Bermuda for the rest. And I tell you, I turn off my irrigation typically with the first significant rainfall. I know sometimes that doesn't happen, but most of the time I just turn it off, and I don't turn it back on for 2 or 3, 4 months. I mean, they're just not necessary to do. So, especially when you have I mean, some would argue, I've had some discussions recently with some of my peers about, like, you know, having a warm season grass that's dormant. Some of them feel, I guess I would agree with to some extent, if you have like dormant grass and you don't water it and it doesn't rain, it's probably going to take a little more time to green up because of it doesn't have as much moisture. But I've never seen anything die. And but that said, with my lawn, I didn't irrigate. I just, whatever Mother Nature gave us this winter, wasn't much. But I mean, my lawn greened up just fine. So I think I'm getting ahead of myself there. We're just talking about days of the week. I was talking about months of the year. But if you have tall fescue and you just want to have that to sustain it, and it's not going to be the award-winning lawn like we saw with the really nice turf with the non-limiting water, then from my experience, there's going to be times in July, August, maybe September, where you need to go as much as 4 times a week. That's max, though. And all the way down to 0 in the wintertime. You don't need to irrigate much in the winter. So, and then it's in between that. So then when it comes to how we divide that up, it kind of depends on your station. I think I have the ability to do like 8 cycles for every station. And so what I do is I just divide those up, especially where I have my front yard that slopes, has a lot of hardscape around it, you know, driveway, street. And so then I try to just divide it into short cycles to minimize runoff and try to maximize infiltration. So it's running like 3 minutes, let's say, and then it goes through all the stations, and then it comes back and it runs the next one, and it just keeps going for however many times. I've already talked about that. Most winters, probably this one too would be one to think about until we came to March. but just turn off the irrigation then. Whoa, what happened? Okay, I didn't have all of my my other things here. So so turn off the system. We talked about the days of week. How much to water? On average, it kind of depends on you know the specific locations, but I think a general ballpark estimate would be like 10 to 14 minutes when you are irrigating. And so like if I have a sloped area, I'm going to do that like, you know, that those cycles are going to add up to a total of like 10 to 14 minutes. And so that's however many times I'm watering in that deep and frequent pattern. So I'm giving it, you know, let's say one area 10 minutes 4 times a week during the hottest part of the year. And then if it's not as hot, I'm just cutting back. I'm not watering as much, maybe 3 days or 2 days. And so, yeah, I'll do the same amount of time, but I'll also just kind of gauge it on terms of how the turf looks. And like I said, the main thing is going to be when these spots start showing up, or if you start seeing like large areas that are really stressed. I mean, and you kind of know that's not just a pattern. It's just that the turf is not enough water, and then you can kind of adjust from there.
So you're being a smart controller rather than a smart controller.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, there's certainly technology available to help do this. I wish, you know, more people had that in their hands or switched to that, but. So I have 10 minutes. I got to hurry. I want to talk a little bit about where we're going because there's some interesting slides to show, but this is our project that we have going on now, and we're kind of focused on these 3 grasses for color retention and drought, even improving drought tolerance, because I'll show you in a moment. I used to think that, you know, I've talked a lot about how the warm season grasses are really drought tolerant, but what I found more recently working in breeding is that there's a lot of variation within these species in terms of their ability to, you know, use water or less water. So, so anyway, I'm going to switch to this. These are just basically the idea. We're trying to develop these grasses for California, in California. But here's a collection of grasses that we've collected from around the world. These are all Bermuda grasses. And we planted them before this time, but in 2016, when we did have a cold winter, this is all Bermuda that's dormant. Look at these guys. This is what we want. You know, there are genotypes that can stay green, and that's what we're trying to locate and to maximize that, optimize. And then the other thing is, these are some of the hybrids we produced, if you will. We crossed these plants that we collected, and we put them out in the field, and we selected the ones that we thought had the best quality traits, and then we put them in this area, and we turned off the irrigation just to see what would happen. And look at these, 5 weeks with no irrigation. Look at that. That has not seen water in 5 weeks. So that's, you know, this is well above and beyond the 20% water savings now. And so we're trying to capitalize on this. So what we're doing now is trying to go back and, well, these are things we've already created, so we're trying to see if we can eventually release them. But we're also interested in, you know, these 2 the parents of these, and then using those for further breeding. To, you know, just to capitalize on all the different traits. Like this is drought tolerance, but then we also want the winter color as well. And so this is 6 weeks without irrigation. So it's pretty amazing. And once we put irrigation back on these, they all greened up. Nothing died. There was no death there. Whereas if you did this to a cool season grass, you would have pretty substantial loss of grass. And you know, we have this project. We're kind of a small breeding program kind of just starting again. I mean, as I mentioned, there's a history of it, but we're funded actually by my former employer, the USGA, and to kind of make things more interesting, or not interesting, but just to ensure that we're going to someday do this as an industry. We have all these grasses from Oklahoma State, Texas A&M, University of Florida, because those are more established, bigger breeding programs. So we're evaluating their material as well.
Did you say you're funded by the United States Golf Association?
Mm-hmm. This grant I showed you, this big project, is now partially funded by the USGA, and then the Metropolitan Water District, and also the Western, because we're in Western's domain. And so, yeah.
That would save them a lot of money, wouldn't
Yeah, I mean, you think about it. I mean, water districts are in the business of doing what? Selling water. So they need, I mean, they also need to, we need to conserve water, but it's nice that they also, understand that turf does have a future, we hope. And so here's our kikuyu grass, and one of the things we're trying to do, this is just an interesting, like, sidelight. We're trying to do this, this process called androgenesis to develop a plant that has half the chromosomes. It's nothing, there's no, like, it's not a GMO or anything like that. We're just trying to we're just stressing out the process, and so we think we're able to produce a kinder, gentler kikuyu grass. And thus far, we've only been able to get to the callus. So some point in time, we want this to differentiate into a plant, leaves and all that, what we know. But we haven't been able to get past this point yet, but at least we got to this point. So we're working on that. Okay, last one is, so we talked about grasses. We talked about irrigation practices and cultural practices, and now just a little bit more about like what products we can do for less water. So this is Bermuda grass here. And so this is Bermuda that the study went on several years, but in these alleyways, these alleyways have never seen any nitrogen for a long time. Look how bad they look. Whereas one of the factors we're looking at with less water is just nitrogen alone. And so this is, going back to our ET thing, 40% replacement of ETO that's really, really stressful. When I mentioned tall fescue, it needs 140%. So this is Bermuda grass at 40, this is 70. 70 is just mildly stressful. The turf looks a lot better. I'm going to switch here. This is the most important thing. So these are some factors. So this is different types of fertilizer, but this is just fertilizer alone under this kind of water stress. So it's definitely helpful compared to this, right? Now you add a wetting agent. This one's called Revolution. A wetting agent helps kind of reduce the surface tension of water, helps spread it out. Look at how uniform that is compared to this with the wetting agent. Then you add, in this case, it didn't look as good as under mild stress. I guess that's what I was trying to show you here. This is a growth regulator, which unfortunately, there's limited uses for lawns. It's kind of, you put it in the hands of the homeowner, it's a little bit dangerous there. So, but you can see the darker color turf under mild stress, not so much here. But then you look at all three of those combined. Fertilizer, this growth regulator, and the wetting agent. That's pretty amazing. So you just do all these things, like the right grass, the right irrigation practices, the right products, the right practices in general, and you could save quite a bit of water.
Can you give an example of what you mean by wetting agent? I mean, is that something you purchase?
Yeah, and unfortunately, and for the homeowner market, there's only one product that I know of, and that's Scott's Every Drop. You seen that one out there? It's a granular wetting agent. So it's not like the best one we've ever seen, but at least it is one that can be purchased. But for like the professional turf market, there's just like literally hundreds of them, and they're not all created equal. Like often, times I've always heard in the past, well, somebody say like, well, I'm just going to take dish soap, which is a surfactant, right? Just like these other things, and I'll just put dish soap and spray that on. Well, it's amazing the technology with surfactants. There are some that can move water through the soil. There are some that help it stay in the soil. I mean, there's all sorts of things, but the one of these ones that is called Revolution is one of the better ones that we found in terms of that. So I know I went through a lot. Thanks for your patience. Any questions before? I know you want to get out of here, get home. Yes?
What do you do with your lawn that you can tell was sod in the beginning?
Okay.
But you can still get that green netting stuff.
Right.
But everything else is kind of taken over it now. We've got the weed that gets those little cockle burrs.
Right.
And then the crabgrass is nuts. And then that's just our front yard. What we found out too is there's a buried septic tank in our front yard.
Uh-huh.
So the dirt on top is just like hard. And
And which grass? Do you know what grass you have? Did you mention
well,
that?
I think it was the fescue.
Tall fescue.
Yeah.
So do you want to convert it to a more water-saving grass?
I don't know how much effort we're going to put into it.
Well, by the way, the other thing I didn't show in this, but the best way to convert your lawn to, let's just say, especially if you're using seed, it's just the easiest. But you want to kill the existing vegetation, and the best thing to do is like a non-selective herbicide like Roundup. And I know that's been getting a lot of bad press lately, but I happen to be one who believes that that's not. I mean, we can have a whole discussion about that, but I think that's the best thing to use. So you're using a non-selective herbicide, you kill all the existing vegetation. You don't even have to. You can use that as sort of a seed bed for the seed you're establishing. That's what I did with my lawn. I killed the tall fescue. I just mowed it down a little bit more, maybe scalped it, and then I just let that serve as like the seed bed for the seed, the mulch, if you will. And I sowed the Bermuda grass and then just let it come up from there. So I didn't even have to scrape it off.
Because we have one established tree that's been there for probably since the house was built, and then we have two smaller trees that.
As long as you're not, it's more of a, it's more of a foliar active kind of herbicide. So you don't want to be, if you have a shallow rooted tree, you don't want to be getting a lot of that herbicide in contact with that. But it's not something that I have trees in my yard, and I went right up to the base. You just want to be careful about that. I didn't have any damage to anything like that. But that's the best way of doing it. We did a study a long time ago with different practices. Like there were some of these companies, like with the buffalo grass, saying that, oh, just plug the buffalo grass into your tall fescue and it's going to take over. Well, that doesn't happen. And so, I think the best way is to kill the vegetation and start from there. Or if you just want to salvage it, like I said, if you have really weedy turf, I mean, there's good post-emergence broadleaf herbicides out there that will get most of those, but I think the waiting for those optimal times for pre-emergence is like for crabgrass. Like if it's July or August and you got a bunch of crabgrass, you might as well just leave it because it's so mature by that time that you just mow it and then spray the pre-emergence in January, February, and you'll take care of, use a good one and they will give you 90, 95, 100% control. So that's the best way to do it.
Would that work in a planter area also?
A planter.
Well, we have one planter that we are now And we dug a tree out, and the roots were like down to here of the crabgrass.
I guess it depends on the other species that are in there. You know, I'd be able to be careful because pre-emergence herbicides have an effect on rooting, and you know the turf roots can, for the most part, can withstand that. But you want to be careful about some of the other. I mean, in general, you know, you can use pre-emergence. Pre-emergence herbicides are used in landscape plants as well. Just got to be careful about what you're using. But like the easiest thing to do is to get it before it emerges. But once it does, I mean, there's some herbicides that could be used, but if you can't manually remove them in a smaller setting, I would just wait till next year. Again, it's just, I mean, the crabgrass is just coming up like at our farm now. We see it. It's not at its prime. If you look down, there's a lot of it. We do a lot of research on herbicides and whatnot, so I purposely don't apply anything for control in case we have to do something. But yeah, it's definitely, it's on its way up and coming. So, any other questions? Okay, thanks.